At just 20 years old, XXXTentacion was a global phenomenon with a $10 million record deal and millions of devoted fans. Yet, while the world celebrated his rise, he was quietly broadcasting his own assassination. He didn't just sense his brutal end, he predicted it on livestream. Why was a young man at the peak of his fame so certain he was being hunted? The answer begins not in the parking lot where he took his final breath, but in the violent, terrifying rooms of his childhood. Jahseh was born on January 23, 1998, in Plantation, Florida. His mother was young and struggling. She moved from one unstable relationship to another, often leaving Jahseh alone or placing him in situations no child should ever face. The men who came into their lives brought more than just presence. They brought violence. Jahseh grew up watching his mother being beaten. He saw her pushed, slapped, and thrown around by men who had no business being in their home. And more than once, when he was still just a boy, Jahseh stepped in. He threw his small body at grown men to protect the only person he had left. Those moments did not simply scare him. They changed him at the deepest level. By the time he reached school age, the damage was already done. Jahseh was repeatedly expelled for fighting. Teachers saw a violent, angry child who could not control himself. What they could not see was a nervous system that had been reprogrammed for survival. The part of the brain called the amygdala, which controls fear and threat response, had been stuck in the on position for years. Every raised voice, every sudden movement, every argument triggered the same reaction: fight. His body was flooded with cortisol and adrenaline from a very young age. These stress hormones became his normal. They gave him energy, but they also kept him in a constant state of high alert. He could not relax. He could not trust. He could not feel safe. Jahseh later described it himself in simple, haunting words: "I don't really talk. I act before I think." Far from a mere boast, these words functioned explicitly as a chilling clinical confession. His brain had learned that thinking took too long. By the time he thought, the danger might already be there. So he acted. He fought. He protected. He survived. Stripped of any conscious choice, this reactive aggression operated as the absolute only survival mechanism his young mind possessed in a world that had taught him again and again that no one else would keep him safe. The violence at home did not stay at home. It followed him into the classroom, onto the playground, and into every relationship he would ever have. He was labeled a problem child. He was sent to alternative schools. He spent time in juvenile detention. Each new environment only reinforced what his nervous system had already learned. The world is dangerous, and the only person you can rely on is yourself. By the time he was a teenager, Jahseh had already been shaped into something the world would later call XXXTentacion. But the foundation had been laid much earlier, in the quiet terror of a childhood no one seemed willing or able to stop. His mother's absence left a hole that nothing could fill. She was often gone, caught in her own cycle of bad relationships and survival. Jahseh was left to navigate the world largely on his own. When she was home, the men she brought with her turned the house into a battlefield. Jahseh learned early that love and violence often came from the same people. This confusion would follow him for the rest of his life. He would later write songs about pain, about betrayal, about wanting to be loved but not knowing how to receive it without destroying it. Those songs did not come from nowhere. They came from a boy who had been forced to grow up too fast in a home where safety was never guaranteed. The constant state of fight or flight did more than make him aggressive. It rewired how he experienced the world. Small things felt like threats. A look, a tone of voice, a disagreement could send him into a rage. His body was always preparing for the next attack. This is what scientists call complex trauma. Transcending a single traumatic event, complex trauma manifests through years of enduring a chronically dangerous environment. The brain adapts. It becomes hypervigilant. It learns to attack first. Jahseh's body had learned this lesson well. By the time he reached his teens, he was already carrying a lifetime of stress hormones in his system. His nervous system did not know how to turn off. School became another arena for the violence that lived inside him. He fought teachers. He fought other students. He was suspended and expelled so many times that education became almost impossible. Adults saw a bad kid. They did not see a child whose brain had been trained to see every situation as a potential fight for survival. Jahseh himself did not understand it at the time. He only knew that when he felt threatened, something inside him took over. He acted before he could think, and the consequences piled up around him. By the time he was 15, Jahseh had already spent significant time in juvenile facilities. The system that was supposed to help him instead reinforced the idea that he was dangerous and broken. He learned to survive in those places the same way he had learned to survive at home, by being the most aggressive person in the room. The cycle continued. The boy who had once tried to protect his mother from abusive men was now becoming the very thing he had fought against. The violence had moved from something done to him to something he did to others. And still, no one seemed able to reach the scared child underneath all that rage. It was during these years that Jahseh began to find an outlet. He started writing. He started making music. At first, it was just a way to get the noise out of his head. But something important happened. The same survival mechanisms that had caused so much destruction in his life began to find a new purpose. The intensity, the rage, the inability to slow down, these things that had gotten him expelled and locked up started to become fuel for something else. When he picked up a microphone, the same energy that once led to fights now poured into his voice. The pain that had shaped him became the raw material for his art. But even then, the old programming remained. Jahseh was fundamentally incapable of creating without self-destructing. The aggressive instincts forged in his childhood didn't suddenly vanish when he found a microphone. They simply found a new battlefield. The music industry would later become that battlefield. Fame would become another form of chaos. And the same boy who had once thrown himself at grown men to protect his mother would one day throw himself into the spotlight with the same reckless intensity. The foundation had been set. The architecture of his mind had been built in those early years of violence and neglect. The inability to slow down or feel truly safe remained a permanent fixture in his life. When Jahseh later stepped onto stages and into recording studios, he brought all of it with him. The genius that millions would later celebrate was born from the same place as the violence that would eventually destroy him. He could not separate the two. They were woven together from the very beginning. As he moved into his late teens, Jahseh began to understand, at least on some level, what had been done to him. He spoke in interviews about his childhood, about the abuse, about the way it had shaped him. But understanding did not equal healing. The nervous system does not forget. The body keeps the score. Even as his music began to reach millions, the boy who had lived in constant survival mode was still there, driving every decision, every outburst, every song. The same mechanisms that had once helped him survive were now pushing him towards self-destruction. And Jahseh, still young, still carrying wounds that had never been properly treated, had no idea how to stop it. The violence that had been planted in Jahseh's childhood did not stay contained. It grew. By the time he reached his mid-teens, the survival mechanisms that had once helped him protect his mother had become something darker and more destructive. He no longer fought only to defend. He fought because fighting had become the only language his nervous system understood. Juvenile detention centers became his second home. He moved in and out of them with disturbing regularity. Each time he returned to the outside world, the rage inside him seemed to have hardened further. The boy who had once stepped between his mother and abusive men was now becoming the source of violence himself. One incident in particular would later define how many people saw him. While locked up, Jahseh brutally assaulted another inmate, a young man who was openly gay. The attack was savage. Witnesses described it as one of the most vicious beatings they had ever seen inside those walls. The victim nearly died. Jahseh showed little remorse at the time. The same hypervigilance that had once kept him alive had twisted into something else. He saw weakness as threat. He saw difference as danger. The fight-or-flight response that had been stuck in the on position for years no longer waited for real danger. It created danger where none existed. This was not simply bad behavior. It was the direct result of a brain that had been trained from a very young age to attack first and ask questions never. Outside of detention, the pattern continued. Jahseh's relationships became battlegrounds. He met Geneva Ayala when he was still a teenager. She became pregnant with his child. What should have been a moment of new beginnings instead turned into one of the darkest chapters of his life. According to court documents and Geneva's own statements, Jahseh subjected her to repeated physical abuse. He choked her. He beat her. He held her against her will while she was carrying his child. The details that emerged during legal proceedings were horrific. Geneva described being punched, kicked, and threatened. She spoke of living in constant fear. Elevating far beyond mere rumors, these stood as heavily documented legal accusations that would permanently follow Jahseh for the rest of his life. At the same time, Jahseh was sinking deeper into drug use. He had discovered benzodiazepines, particularly Xanax. At first, the pills seemed to offer relief. The constant noise in his head, the racing thoughts, the inability to feel calm, Xanax quieted all of it. But the relief was temporary and came at a terrible cost. Benzodiazepines work by slowing down brain activity. Over time, heavy use damages the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, impulse control, and long-term thinking. Jahseh was essentially chemically dismantling the very system that could have helped him make better choices. The more he used to feel normal, the more damaged his ability to control himself became. A cruel paradox emerged. The Xanax was supposed to calm him down. Instead, it made him more volatile. When the sedative effects wore off, he would often create conflict just to feel something familiar. The chaos felt normal. The adrenaline felt like home. His body had been conditioned for years to operate in a state of high stress. When the drugs tried to lower that stress, his system rebelled. He would pick fights, start arguments, or escalate situations until the familiar surge of cortisol and adrenaline returned. It was as if his nervous system needed the chaos to feel balanced. This was not a conscious choice. It was the result of years of neurological reprogramming that no one had ever tried to undo. By his late teens, Jahseh was trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. The violence he had experienced as a child had become the violence he inflicted on others. The drugs he took to quiet his mind were destroying his ability to think clearly. The legal troubles kept piling up. He had already spent significant time behind bars, and more charges were coming. His relationship with Geneva collapsed under the weight of abuse and fear. He was becoming exactly what the system had always told him he was: dangerous, broken, and out of control. Yet underneath all of it, the scared boy who had once tried to protect his mother was still there, buried beneath layers of trauma and rage he had never been taught how to process. It was during this period that Jahseh began to pour more energy into music. What had started as a hobby was becoming something more serious. He recorded songs in makeshift studios, posted them online, and watched as small numbers of listeners began to grow. The raw emotion in his voice, the pain that poured out of every track, started to connect with people who felt just as broken as he did. For the first time, the survival mechanisms that had caused so much destruction were finding a different outlet. The intensity that had once led to fights was now being channeled into music. But even here, the old patterns remained. Jahseh did not know how to create without self-destructing. He did not know how to express pain without causing more pain. The nervous system that had been stuck in fight or flight for years did not suddenly switch off just because he found a microphone. The drugs continued, the violence continued, the legal problems continued. Jahseh was spiraling, but he was also beginning to build something. The same fire that had burned through his childhood and teenage years was now starting to burn through the underground music scene. People were noticing the raw honesty in his lyrics, the way he screamed and whispered and bled into every song, felt different from anything else happening at the time. He was not polished. He was not trying to fit into any box. He was simply pouring out everything that had been trapped inside him for years. Fame arrived like a sudden storm that Jahseh was not prepared to weather. In 2016, a song called "Look at Me" exploded across the internet. What had started as a raw underground track quickly spread far beyond anything he had imagined. Millions of young people who felt angry, broken, and invisible suddenly found a voice that matched their pain. Jahseh, now performing as XXXTentacion, went from being a troubled teenager with a small following to a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. But the same nervous system that had been stuck in permanent survival mode for years did not suddenly relax when the world began to pay attention. Instead, the spotlight only made the old alarms ring louder. Jahseh began to believe that powerful people in the music industry wanted him dead. The paranoia that had been building inside him since childhood found new targets. He started making public statements that shocked even his most dedicated fans. In one interview, he claimed that if anyone ever killed him, it would be Drake. The statement was delivered with unsettling certainty, as if he had already accepted it as fact. He spoke openly about feeling hunted, about sensing that forces much larger than himself were working against him. The same hypervigilance that had once kept him alive on the streets of Florida was now scanning the entire music industry for threats. Every success seemed to confirm his fears rather than calm them. The more popular he became, the more dangerous the world appeared. At the same time, Jahseh began to reshape his own story into something almost mythical. He started presenting himself not just as an artist, but as a kind of wounded prophet. He spoke about his pain as if it were a necessary sacrifice, something he had to endure so that others could heal. He called it the golden cocoon, the idea that his suffering was part of a larger purpose, that his trauma was transforming into something beautiful that would eventually protect and inspire millions of young people. Moving far beyond simple artistic branding, this ideology operated as a profound, genuine belief that grew stronger as his fame increased. The boy who had once fought to survive was now positioning himself as someone chosen to carry the weight of other people's pain. In a series of live streams, Jahseh spoke directly to his fans about the possibility of his own death. He did not speak about it with fear. He spoke about it with a strange sense of acceptance, almost as if he were preparing them for something he already knew was coming. In one particularly haunting moment, he said, "If the worst-case scenario happens and I have to die, I at least want to know that the kids got my message." The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Millions watched. Many were moved. Others were disturbed. But for Jahseh, these statements were not performance. They were the logical conclusion of a mind that had been trained since childhood to expect danger at every turn. The same brain that had once seen every raised voice as a potential attack was now seeing the entire world as a threat. The paranoia deepened with every new level of success. He began to interpret normal industry interactions as signs of betrayal. Meetings with executives, conversations with other artists, even simple business decisions were filtered through the lens of someone who believed his life was in danger. The same intensity that had once made him fight grown men to protect his mother was now being directed at invisible enemies. He trusted almost no one. He pushed people away. He isolated himself even as millions claimed to understand him. The fame that was supposed to bring validation instead fed the very fears that had shaped him since he was a small boy. Yet, alongside the paranoia, something else was growing. Jahseh's music was reaching people in ways few artists ever achieve. Young fans wrote to him about how his songs had saved their lives, how his willingness to be raw and broken had given them permission to feel their own pain. He read these messages and seemed to take them as confirmation of his purpose. The golden cocoon philosophy became more than just a personal belief. It became a mission. He started to see himself as someone who had been chosen to carry suffering so that others would not have to. This Messiah complex, born from years of trauma and now amplified by sudden fame, created a dangerous combination. He was both terrified of the world and convinced that he had been sent to save it. The live streams became more frequent and more intense. Jahseh would sit in front of the camera for hours, speaking directly to his fans about life, pain, love, and death. He cried openly. He screamed. He whispered. He shared thoughts that most people would keep private. In one stream, he returned to the idea of his own mortality, telling his audience that if something happened to him, he wanted them to remember the message behind his music. The words felt heavy, almost like a farewell. Fans who watched these streams often described feeling both inspired and deeply uneasy. There was a sense that Jahseh was carrying something much larger than himself, and that the weight was becoming too much. As his fame continued to grow, the gap between the public image of XXXTentacion and the private reality of Jahseh Onfroy widened dramatically. On stage and in his music, he was a force of raw emotion and unflinching honesty. Behind the scenes, he was a young man still haunted by the same demons that had shaped his childhood. The paranoia, the belief that he was being hunted, the conviction that his pain served a higher purpose, all of it existed alongside the genuine desire to help others. He was not simply playing a role. He was living inside a story he had created to make sense of his own suffering. And that story was beginning to consume him. The same nervous system that had been stuck in fight or flight since he was a child was now operating at full capacity in a world that offered no real safety. Every new level of success brought new threats, both real and imagined. Every new fan brought new expectations. Every new dollar brought new people who wanted something from him. Jahseh responded the only way he knew how. He fought. He created. He pushed forward with the same reckless intensity that had defined his entire life. But the cracks were beginning to show. The boy who had once thrown himself at danger to protect his mother was now throwing himself at fame with the same abandon. And the world, hungry for his pain, was more than happy to watch. Jahseh stood at the center of a storm he had helped create. His music had given voice to millions. His willingness to be broken in public had inspired countless young people. But the same qualities that made him powerful were also the qualities that were slowly destroying him. The paranoia was growing. The Messiah complex was deepening. And beneath it all, the scared child who had never truly felt safe was still there, driving every decision, every outburst, every song. He was moving towards something he could not yet see, carrying the weight of a lifetime of trauma into a spotlight that only made the shadows darker. The prophecy he had spoken so many times was no longer just words. It was beginning to feel like destiny. And Jahseh, still only 20 years old, was walking straight toward it with the same defiant courage that had once kept him alive on the streets of Florida. On the morning of June 18th, 2018, Jahseh Onfroy woke up as a 20-year-old millionaire. He had just signed a major record deal worth around $10 million. The boy who had once slept in unstable homes and fought grown men to protect his mother was now standing at the edge of mainstream success. But success had not brought safety. It had only made the old fears louder. That morning he decided to drive himself. There were no bodyguards, no entourage, just Jahseh, his matte black BMW i8, and $50,000 in cash stuffed inside a Louis Vuitton bag, resting on the passenger seat. He drove to Riva Motorsports, a high-end motorcycle and power sports dealership in Deerfield Beach, Florida. He had been there before. The staff knew him. On this particular day, he seemed relaxed, almost playful. He looked at motorcycles, talked with employees, and eventually made a purchase. When he left the dealership around 3:40 in the afternoon, he had no idea that 4 young men in a Dodge Journey had already spotted him. They had been watching the parking lot. One of them, Dedrick Williams, walked into a nearby store and bought a black ski mask. It was an ordinary transaction. No one inside the store thought anything of it. But that mask would soon become part of one of the most shocking moments in recent hip-hop history. The 4 men waited. They were patient. For 8 minutes and 35 seconds, they sat in their car, watching Jahseh's every move. They knew who he was. They had seen the luxury car. They had seen the Louis Vuitton bag. And they had seen the way he moved, alone, without protection. In their eyes, he was not a troubled artist or a cultural icon. He was simply a target. A young man driving an expensive car with a bag full of cash and no one watching his back. At 3:55 p.m., Jahseh pulled out of the dealership parking lot. As he approached the exit, the Dodge Journey suddenly swerved in front of him, blocking his path. The BMW came to a stop. Before Jahseh could react, 3 of the men jumped out. One of them was wearing the ski mask Dedrick Williams had just purchased. They approached the car quickly. Jahseh, who had spent his entire life responding to threats with aggression, did not freeze. He did not put his hands up. He fought back. The confrontation lasted only seconds. Jahseh opened the door and tried to push the men away. His last words, caught clearly on the dealership's security camera, were, "What the fuck is this?" There was no fear in his voice, only confusion and defiance. The same defiance that had once made him throw himself at grown men as a child was still there. But this time, the danger was not a drunk boyfriend in his mother's house. This time, the danger had guns. One of the men, later identified as Michael Boatwright, raised his weapon and fired multiple shots at close range. The bullets struck Jahseh directly in the neck. He collapsed back into the driver's seat of his own car. Blood poured from the wounds. The attackers grabbed the Louis Vuitton bag containing the $50,000 and fled in the Dodge Journey. They left Jahseh bleeding and dying behind the wheel of his BMW i8. The entire attack had taken less than a minute. By the time emergency services arrived, Jahseh was unconscious. Paramedics worked on him at the scene, but the damage was too severe. Multiple gunshot wounds to the neck had caused catastrophic blood loss. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was already too late. At 4:18 p.m., just 23 minutes after the shooting, Jahseh Dwayne Ricardo Onfroy, known to the world as XXXTentacion, was pronounced dead. He was 20 years old. The news spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media was flooded with tributes, disbelief, and grief. Fans who had followed his rise from underground SoundCloud rapper to mainstream star could not understand how someone so young and so full of life could be gone. The same voice that had screamed and whispered and bled into millions of headphones had been silenced in the most brutal way possible. The boy who had once predicted his own death in live streams had now fulfilled that prophecy in the driver's seat of his own car. The four men who carried out the attack did not get far. Their arrogance would be their downfall. Later that same day, they posted photos and videos on social media showing themselves with stacks of cash, some of it still stained with Jahseh's blood. They bragged, they celebrated. They had no idea that their own phones and social media accounts would become the evidence that would eventually convict them. Within days, all four, Dedrick Williams, Michael Boatwright, Trayvon Newsom, and Robert Allen, were arrested. They would later be convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But in those first hours after the shooting, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that a 20-year-old man who had survived an abusive childhood, juvenile detention, and years of personal demons had finally been brought down by strangers who saw him as nothing more than a target. The same nervous system that had kept him alive through so much had failed to protect him in the end. The same defiance that had defined his entire life had led him to fight back instead of surrendering, and that defiance had cost him everything. The men who killed Jahseh Onfroy did not disappear into the night like professional criminals. They made mistakes that would seem almost unbelievable if they had not been so well documented. Within hours of the shooting, photos and videos began appearing on social media. The four young men, Dedrick Williams, Michael Boatwright, Trayvon Newsom, and Robert Allen, were seen posing with large stacks of cash. Some of the money was visibly stained with blood. They smiled. They celebrated. They posted the images as if they had just won the lottery. What they did not realize was that these very posts would become the key evidence that would eventually destroy them. Police moved quickly. The social media trail was obvious and damning. Within days, all four men were arrested. The investigation revealed that they had targeted Jahseh because of his expensive car and the bag he was carrying. They had no personal connection to him. They did not know his music or his story. To them, he was simply a young man with money who appeared to be alone and unprotected. The attack had been opportunistic, brutal, and ultimately pointless. They gained $50,000 and destroyed a life that had already been marked by so much pain. In return, they received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Each of them would spend the rest of their days behind bars, paying for a decision that had taken less than a minute to carry out. While the legal system moved with relative speed, the public reaction was far more complicated. Almost immediately after news of Jahseh's death spread, something strange began to happen. The young man, who had been accused of serious domestic violence, who had admitted to struggling with anger and mental health issues, was suddenly transformed into something else entirely. He was no longer just an artist. He became a martyr, a saint, a symbol of a generation that felt broken and misunderstood. Fans created murals, held vigils, and flooded social media with tributes. His music streams skyrocketed. His image was everywhere, on shirts, posters, and tattoos. The complexity of his life seemed to disappear overnight. The allegations of abuse against his pregnant ex-girlfriend Geneva Ayala were pushed aside or outright ignored by many of his most devoted fans. Court documents that had once painted a disturbing picture of violence were rarely mentioned in the wave of grief that followed his death. Instead, Jahseh was remembered as a tortured soul who had been taken too soon. His pain was romanticized. His struggles were turned into proof of his genius. The same young man who had once been criticized for his behavior was now being celebrated as if he had been a victim of the world rather than someone who had also hurt others. This shift happened with startling speed. Within days, the narrative had changed completely. There were voices that tried to push back. Some pointed out the danger of erasing the harm he had caused, particularly to women. Others argued that it was possible to mourn his death while still acknowledging the full truth of his life. But these voices were often drowned out by the overwhelming wave of grief and idolization. Jahseh had become larger than himself. He had become a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to remain complicated. The young man who had once spoken openly about his own demons was now being remembered in a way that made those demons disappear. It was as if his death had granted him a kind of sainthood that his life had never earned. This transformation revealed something uncomfortable about the way we consume pain in the age of social media. Jahseh's raw honesty and willingness to expose his struggles had made him beloved. But when he died, that same honesty was selectively forgotten. The parts of his story that made people uncomfortable, the violence, the abuse allegations, the legal troubles, were quietly set aside. What remained was a simplified version of him, a talented young artist who had been taken too soon by a cruel world. This version was easier to mourn. It was easier to turn into merchandise and hashtags. But it was not the full truth. The truth was far more painful and far more human. Jahseh Onfroy had been both a victim and a perpetrator. He had survived horrific childhood trauma that had rewired his nervous system. He had carried that trauma into his relationships and into his music. He had hurt people, most notably the mother of his child. He had also created art that helped millions of young people feel less alone. These two realities existed in the same person. They were not separate. They were connected. The same wounds that gave his music its power had also caused real harm to others. To celebrate one part while completely ignoring the other was to do him a disservice. In the weeks and months after his death, this tension became impossible to ignore. Some fans began to speak more openly about the complexity of his legacy. They pointed out that loving his music did not require pretending he had been a perfect person. Others doubled down on the martyr narrative, accusing anyone who mentioned his past behavior of disrespecting the dead. The debate revealed a deeper discomfort in our culture, a discomfort with holding two truths at the same time. We want our icons to be either heroes or villains. We struggle with the reality that most people, especially those who have suffered deeply, contain both light and darkness. Jahseh's death also forced a conversation about mental health, trauma, and the pressures of sudden fame. Many of his fans were young people who saw themselves in his story. They had followed his rise, listened to his music when they felt broken, and now had to process his violent end. For some, it was a wake-up call about the importance of healing. For others, it became another layer of pain in an already difficult world. The same artist who had given them permission to feel their own struggles had now left them with new ones. His death did not end the conversation. In many ways, it deepened it. As the legal proceedings against his killers moved forward, the public's focus remained split between grief and controversy. The 4 men who had taken his life were eventually sentenced to life without parole. Justice in the narrow legal sense had been served, but the larger questions remained unanswered. What does it mean to mourn someone who had also caused harm? How do we separate the art from the artist when the artist's life was so deeply marked by both suffering and the suffering he inflicted on others? These were not easy questions, and Jahseh's death had made them impossible to avoid. In the years that followed his death, XXXTentacion's influence did not fade. It grew deeper and more complicated. A new generation of artists studied his music with almost religious intensity. They analyzed his flows, his ability to move between screaming rage and fragile vulnerability, and the way he turned personal pain into something that felt universal. His voice, raw, unpolished, and emotionally naked, became a blueprint for a different kind of hip-hop, one that no longer hid behind bravado or perfection. Young artists who had once felt invisible now saw themselves reflected in his songs. He had proven that it was possible to be broken and still be heard. That lesson alone changed the sound of an entire generation. Yet the psychological legacy he left behind was far heavier. Jahseh Onfroy had carried complex PTSD from his earliest years, a condition born from repeated trauma that had rewired his nervous system into a permanent state of survival. That same wiring had made him both brilliant and dangerous. It had given him the intensity that fueled his art, but it had also made it nearly impossible for him to form healthy relationships or control his impulses. The cycle of violence he had experienced as a child had followed him into adulthood, and in the end, it had claimed both victims and perpetrator. His story became a painful reminder that unhealed trauma does not simply disappear, it transforms. It finds new ways to express itself, sometimes through art, sometimes through harm, and often through both at the same time. By 2026, his death had taken on new meaning. We now live in a world where young people are pushed into fame faster and harder than ever before. Social media rewards raw emotion and public breakdowns. Suffering is turned into content. The same culture that once celebrated Jahseh's willingness to bleed on camera has created an environment where many young artists feel they must destroy themselves to be seen. His story now serves as both inspiration and warning. It shows what is possible when someone turns their pain into something beautiful, but it also shows what happens when that pain is never truly addressed. The boy who had been shaped by violence had never been given the tools to heal. Fame had only made the wounds deeper. The question that lingers is not whether Jahseh was a good person or a bad person. That question is too simple for a life this complex. The real question is what we choose to learn from him. His music gave millions of young people permission to feel their own pain. His life showed us the devastating cost of carrying unhealed trauma into a world that often rewards self-destruction. His death forced us to confront how easily we turn complicated human beings into simple symbols, and how dangerous it is to celebrate the art while ignoring the artist's suffering. Jahseh Ricardo Onfroy died on June 18, 2018, at the age of 20. He left behind a body of work that continues to move people, and a story that continues to haunt them. He was a product of a broken system, a broken home, a broken understanding of mental health, and eventually a broken relationship with fame. He was also a young man who tried, in his own flawed way, to turn his pain into something that could help others. Both of these truths existed in him. Both deserve to be remembered. Perhaps the most important lesson his life offers is this: no amount of talent, fame, or success can heal wounds that were never properly treated. Jahseh had survived an abusive childhood, juvenile detention, and years of inner chaos. He had turned that survival into art that touched the world, but he had never been given the chance to truly heal. The same nervous system that had once kept him alive had eventually destroyed him. That is the real tragedy. Not just that he died young, but that so much of what led to his death had been set in motion long before the world ever knew his name. We can love his music. We can respect his talent. We can mourn the life that was taken from him. But we must also be honest about the full picture. Jahseh Onfroy was both a victim and someone who caused harm. He was both a brilliant artist and a deeply wounded young man. Holding both truths at the same time is uncomfortable. It is also necessary, because only by facing the full complexity of his life can we begin to understand the deeper lessons it holds. In the end, XXXTentacion's story is not just about one artist who rose and fell. It is about all of us who carry invisible wounds, who push through pain because we were never taught another way, and who sometimes mistake survival for living. It is about a culture that celebrates the art born from trauma while doing very little to prevent the trauma itself. And it is about the quiet courage it takes to finally stop running and start healing. Jahseh is gone, but the questions he left behind remain. And perhaps that is his most lasting legacy. Not the platinum records or the screaming crowds, but the uncomfortable mirror he held up to all of us. A mirror that shows how easily we turn pain into spectacle, how quickly we forget the humanity behind the icon, and how desperately we need to do better for the next generation of scared children who are still learning the hard way that the world can be cruel.